Okay, so all this back and forth between Venezuela and Guyana. It's really starting to feel like something big could be brewing, like maybe even involving the U.S.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah,
All that tough talk. Plus, the U.S. seems to be getting a lot more vocal about backing up Guyana. I mean, it definitely raises the stakes for everyone in the region and beyond.
exactly. So for everyone listening, we're going to try to break down what's going on here. What's the real threat from Venezuela to Guyana right now? What's the U.S. really promising in terms of protection? And if things do get worse, what could it mean for Venezuela? And, a lot of people are wondering, is the U.S. just trying to protect Guyana, or are they thinking about, say, oil? Are there other interests in play here? We've been digging into some recent statements, especially from U.S. Secretary Rubio, to get a better handle on this situation.
And, Secretary Rubio going to Guyana, like actually going there, that really shows you how seriously the U.S. is taking this. It wasn't just like some routine diplomatic thing, His words seem to carry a lot more weight than that.
Oh, yeah. He definitely didn't mince words. He came right out and said the U.S. government has a personal commitment to Guyana and the whole region. That's a pretty strong statement, don't you think?
It is. It really is. And when he told Guyana's president, flat out, we want to be your partner, it's like, okay, they want to work together more closely. But it makes you wonder, what's in it for the U.S.? What do they see as the advantage here?
Right. It's not just about being a nice neighbor, is it? I mean, Secretary Rubio even said this partnership is, and I'm quoting here, of mutual benefit. So what do you think the U.S. is hoping to get out of all this?
Well, from what Secretary Rubio said, it seems like the biggest thing is stability in the region. His argument is that a stable Guyana, well, it could actually help stabilize neighboring countries too. The whole Caribbean and even beyond.
Okay, so this idea of contagious stability, let's dig into that a little. What does that actually mean for the U.S.?
Well, think about it like this. A Guyana that's safe and doing well economically. It can do things like strengthen trade relationships, maybe cut down on illegal stuff happening across borders, and just make it a better place for investment in the whole region. But if Guyana is not stable, things could go the other way. It could pull other countries into the mess and make the whole area less secure. So for the U.S., a stable Guyana is kind of like an anchor for the region. But you got to think about how Venezuela sees all this. They might see it as the U.S., trying to boss everyone around in their own backyard. And that can make them even more worried about outside interference.
That's a really good point about Venezuela's point of view. And Secretary Rubio also linked this whole regional stability thing to U.S. interests. He said it makes America safer and more prosperous. How do you see that connection?
So what he's saying is, a region that's stable and doing well economically is less likely to, become a hotbed for criminal organizations like drug traffickers, for example. He actually talked about how the U.S. wants to prevent those groups from messing with Guyana, especially as Guyana starts to develop its resources. A more stable region also usually means stronger economic ties and less disruption to global trade. And that, of course, helps the U.S. economy. So it's like they're trying to get ahead of the problems, nip things in the bud before they become a big problem for the U.S., both security-wise and economically.
So it's a proactive move. Try to head off those potential security and economic problems down the line.
Exactly. And he didn't hesitate to call out, what he sees as the source of the instability. He talked about illegitimate territorial claims by a narco-trafficking regime, which is pretty clearly a shot at Venezuela. This label that the U.S. uses, it's about allegations that, some high-up people in the Venezuelan government are involved in drug trafficking. And that just adds another layer of complexity to the whole border dispute.
And then he really turned up the heat when he started talking about consequences. He issued this pretty strong warning saying there will be consequences for adventurism, there will be consequences for aggressive actions. It sounds like a direct message to Venezuela.
Oh, absolutely. That's the U.S. saying, listen, if you mess with Guyana, there's going to be a response.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, how's Venezuela taking all of this?
Yeah, which leads to the big question everyone's asking. If Venezuela actually attacked Guyana, would the U.S. military get involved? A reporter asked Secretary Rubio that directly.
They did. And he didn't give specifics about military plans or anything, but his answer was pretty strong. He said it would be a very bad day or even a very bad week for Venezuela if they attacked Guyana or even went after ExxonMobil's operations in Guyanese waters. It sounds like he's saying it would not end well for them.
But he was vague about what exactly the U.S. would do, right?
Right. That's actually pretty common in diplomacy and security stuff. It's better to be a little ambiguous. It keeps the other side guessing,
Right.
which can actually be a better way to stop them from doing something than, laying out all your plans.
True. But he did go out of his way to mention the U.S. Navy and how they can operate all over the world, almost like a subtle show of force.
Exactly. It's like a little reminder of how strong the U.S. military is and how they can project power anywhere. He also talked about the security agreements the U.S. already has with Guyana and how they want to build on those.
Yeah.
That suggests they're thinking long-term about security cooperation in the region. And even though Secretary Rubio didn't mention specific ships or anything, the U.S. Navy has a pretty big presence in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Everything from patrol boats to aircraft carriers. So they have a lot of options.
And he said again that the U.S. is committed to making sure these illegitimate territorial claims don't stop Guyana from developing its country. Sounds like they're pretty firm on that.
Yeah, they are. The U.S. is putting itself out there as like a protector of Guyana's sovereignty, saying Guyana has the right to use its resources and grow its economy without being threatened.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Secretary Rubio also mentioned how Guyana has the potential for what he called transformative change. And he wasn't just talking about oil and gas.
That's a really interesting point. He specifically mentioned things like data centers, digital stuff, artificial intelligence. All those things need a lot of reliable energy, right? He also talked about expanding agriculture and ecotourism. So it sounds like the U.S. sees Guyana as a partner that could grow in a lot of different areas, not just energy. They're not just focused on the immediate security threats. They're thinking about a long-term partnership.
It's like he's describing a future where Guyana has a more diverse, modern economy and isn't so reliant on oil.
Exactly. And to make that happen, you need stability and security. So the security commitment from the U.S., it's kind of like a foundation for that partnership and for Guyana's economic growth.
Which brings us back to the role of oil in all of this.
Right.
A reporter from Starbuck News asked specifically about ExxonMobil's operations in Guyana's waters. They wanted to know what the U.S. would do if Venezuela attacked ExxonMobil.
Right. And Secretary Rubio's answer was pretty much the same as his earlier warning. He said it would be a very bad day for Venezuela. And this is important because it directly ties the safety of U.S. interests in this case, a huge American oil company, to the U.S.'s commitment to protecting Guyana.
So the official reasons for the U.S. involvement are about regional stability and supporting Guyana's sovereignty, but the fact that a big U.S. oil company like ExxonMobil is operating in the disputed area, that definitely adds another dimension, doesn't it? It's hard to ignore the economic factors here. I mean, you can't really talk about this without thinking about the economics. Secretary Rubio mentioned Guyana's potential beyond oil, but the reality is that ExxonMobil, a big U.S. company, has a lot invested in the waters that are being disputed. What do you think? How much of a factor is that in the U.S.'s decision-making?
Well, it's definitely a mix of things. The U.S. has a strategic interest in keeping the region stable, and Secretary Rubio was clear about that. But you can't ignore the fact that the U.S. has a lot invested in Guyana's oil through ExxonMobil. Protecting those investments is in line with U.S. economic interests, so it's reasonable to assume it plays a role, even if it's not the only reason. I mean, historically, protecting its economic interests abroad has been a big part of U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, so to sum it up, the U.S. has made some strong promises to protect Guyana from Venezuela. Their reasons. They want to keep the region stable, stop the spread of crime, and ultimately protect U.S. security and prosperity. But the oil reserves in Guyana, especially with ExxonMobil's investments, they seem to be a big part of this, even if it's not the only thing.
That's a good summary. The U.S. is giving a bunch of reasons for getting involved, and it looks like security and economic interests are pretty intertwined. And the way Secretary Rubio is talking, it definitely sounds like they're serious about their commitment.
So, knowing how strongly the U.S. is talking and, thinking about the power of their military, how do you think Venezuela is reacting to all of this? What might they do next? And do you think the U.S. is really just trying to scare Venezuela off, or would they actually get more directly involved if Venezuela doesn't back down? Thinking about all that, put yourself in Venezuela's shoes for a minute. How do you think their leaders are interpreting all this tough talk from the U.S.? Will it make them think twice, or could it actually make them react in a more unpredictable way?
Those are the million-dollar questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Venezuela's leaders are definitely paying close attention to everything Secretary Rubio said. They're trying to figure out how serious the U.S. really is. They might tone down their own rhetoric or maybe try to get support from other countries. But there's always the risk that one side or the other miscalculates. Right now, it seems like the U.S. is mostly trying to deter Venezuela, but their warnings also suggest they're ready to do more if Venezuela gets aggressive. It's a tough balancing act, trying to look strong without making things worse.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. If the U.S. gets involved in this region, it could have some major consequences. It could change the whole geopolitical landscape of South America, and it would for sure impact global energy politics. It's a situation we need to keep a close eye on. Thanks for diving into this with us today. Now, as you're thinking about all this, take a step back and think about the bigger picture. How could this affect other territorial disputes around the world? Does a major power like the U.S. getting involved set a precedent? And what does it mean for international law and diplomacy in the long run? This is a web of interconnected issues, and it goes way beyond just what we're seeing in the headlines.